right now. We are now recording and live at 12 o'clock for our first Beth Lunch and Learn. I was on Matthew Klein. Little procedural stuff before we start learning. Please mute yourself as you come in, either on your phone or on your computer. While we'll be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then you'll have an opportunity to leave comments in the chat box if you're online. For folks on the phone, I'm sorry, please do email me privately. I've also emailed out a source sheet that we'll be using. You have a link to it in in your email, and also I'm just putting it right in the chat right now if you want to re-access it. So today, it is the 4th of Elul. It is the month of Elul. It is a time to talk about sort of big ideas. When I first looked at the number of people that were on this call, it was 42, and I think it's actually grown in terms of people who have signed up. You'll see we're kind of going up one by one. And of course, 42 is a number of great significance, according to the great American Rebbe, Douglas Adams, that 42 relates to the meaning of life, which is very appropriate, as the meaning of life is really at the heart of the essential questions of Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and the month of Elul. Today, I want to focus on one big question, and that is the question of how do we change? We all have ways that we want to be different. We want to be more successful, more patient, thinner, wealthier, or more organized, or less busy, or more compassionate, more focused, or more whole in some way. And forgive me as I mute people if a little beeps come. So change science and change.
Great.
If you could just mute yourself as you come in. I'm trying to catch up, but we've got a wonderful crowd. Getting back to change science.
I'm young.
Hello. So change science is very big in America and in the organizational world. Barnes and Noble's bookshelves are again filled with books about different researchers or people's personal experiences, and you maybe have read them. So full disclaimer, on the subject of change, I'm not a self-help guru. However, one thing that I suspect unites you and I and many of us on this call is that we're growing Jews and we're curious about our Jewish selves and how the tradition is sending relevant wisdom our way. So what I hope to offer today are a few big ideas from Jewish tradition and faith that can offer us some actual practical steps that we can take during the Elul season. So these will relate also to the handout of Jewish sources that I've included, which I will put up on the big screen as we get to it. And again, I also share much of this Torah in the name of Rabbi Shai Held, with whom I studied yesterday. He's the chair of Jewish thought at Machon Hadar, which is probably one of the best online resources for Jewish learning that there is, I think. So, to the topic of personal change. Number one, that's just the way I am. And try to think about ourselves, whether we're religious or not. We're faced with the dilemma of trying to change parts of ourselves while also coming up against things that may feel like the immutable essence of ourselves. Sort of torn between the desire for change and the feeling of, well, this is just the way I am. I'm not going to change that part of me. We have responses or stories or feelings that may be heavily conditioned by our past. Some of us might say, if you had my childhood, if you had my mother, you wouldn't ask anything more of me than what I already do, right? So how does Jewish faith deal with this dialogue between self-acceptance, which is a big thing in America right now, self-acceptance, or personal growth? How do these two work in tandem? So I have one source that I'm going to share for you and throw up. This is the first source on the sheet. I'm going to throw up on the screen. Let's see. Is it there? Can you see it? Someone can type yes. I will keep going. So before there were Deepak Chopra or Tony Robbins or anyone like that, there was Rambam, Maimonides, and indeed many different sources and Jews who wrote about tshuva, about returning to one's essential self. So this is Rambam's Hilchot Deot, which is the laws of your mind or personal change. This is what Rambam says in the 12th century. He says that each and every person possesses many character traits. And each trait is very different and distant from the others. One type of person is wrathful, he is constantly angry. In contrast, there's the calm individual who is never moved to anger, or will be slightly angry once over several years. There's a prideful person, and one who's really, really humble. There's a person ruled by his appetites, who will never be satisfied from his desires. And, conversely, the very pure of heart, who doesn't even desire a little bit that the body needs. And this is his main point. Between each trait and contrasting trait at the other extreme, there are intermediate points, each distant from the other. With regard to all traits, a person has from the beginning of his conception in accordance with his bodily nature. Some are appropriate to a person's nature and will therefore be acquired more easily than other traits. That is to say that some character traits are in your nature. You're more predisposed to having a certain trait or to growing in a certain way. Rambam continues, some traits he does not have from birth. He may have learned them from others or turned them on his own. This may have come as a result of his own thoughts, or because he heard that there was a proper trait for him, which he ought to attain. Therefore, he accustomed himself to it until it became a part of himself. So this sounds a little wordy. To my mind, what's interesting about this is that Rambam is starting, you could say, his Jewish self-help book on tshuva in the 12th century, and he's starting it with a bit of a downer. He's starting it with, look, some people are born with certain predilections and certain traits that make change harder or easier. And I think that this actually is related just to our first learning of the day, which really has to do with taking inventory of yourself. There are many, many ideals out in the world today, many, many ideals that one can strive to. And it's important, and perhaps I think in Rambam's conception, to look at one's nature and see what is easier for you and what is harder for you in terms of your midot, of your qualities. And so, my sort of take-home practice, number one, my first take-home practice is really an inventory, to take a coffee morning and sit down with a journal and say, really, what are my character traits? As I look at me, what's easy for me? What's hard? And what can I leverage for change, and what's that going to look like? Really just taking an inventory of oneself, because some traits are going to be harder and some are easier. And if we don't have an inventory of who we are, the move forward to change is not going to be as easy. So I actually have a link that you can use, and I'm going to pull up here, that has a list of midot from the Musar tradition, that is the tradition of Jewish ethics, and learning Jewish character ethics and virtue ethics. And so I'm going to throw that into the chat, and you can use that at your leisure. It's on the second page that you can find the list of midot. So that's number one, and I'm 8 minutes in. I think I'm right on time. Thank God. So that's number one, is really taking an inventory of our traits as a basis for where we can move forward. Okay, number two, the story of I. So I'm moving down a little bit to this little source right here, the story of I. In Judaism, and this is a very contemporary conversation. In Judaism, we have a strong tradition of I, of an essential self. And this indeed is the center of how and why God can call us to be responsible. As we see here in the source in Deuteronomy 5:5, Moses says, I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. Moses' leadership is rooted not in being an essential I, in being a self, in his selfhood. It's in some ways, thinking about selfhood for Moses and for us is a pillar for communal and personal change. That's probably just something to think about. In some ways, that could be seen as being in conflict with our modern era. In some New Age, and actually particularly Buddhist teachings, they will say that the self is really something to be let go of, right? It's a burden that causes suffering and accrues karma. And the extent that you can let that self go is the extent that you'll find happiness. So I think that, to do a little critique of the prevailing culture, Judaism can and will never go that far. with the exception of some little bits of Hasidic sources. But the main of the tradition, uh, to my sense of it, is that Judaism, the idea of an essential self, is fundamental to our belief in our own responsibility, and indeed to being in the image of God, who is the ultimate self. But, and this is to point number 2 for today. Number 1 was about taking an inventory. Number 2 is perhaps a point of confidence for Judaism here, is the idea that the story of who we are, at least the story we've been telling ourselves so far, need not be such a fixed thing. So many of us probably on this call have stories about who we are, top-notch lawyer, flawless surgeon, compassionate counselor, patient parent, doting spouse. I'm a person, let's say, who's really in control of my life or in control of the world or who knows what the right thing is to do most of the time. So some of these stories are helpful, and perhaps for some of you, some are not. For teshuvah, this Jewish idea of repentance, of personal change, the idea, I think, is that our story need not be the last word. In order to make space to do tshuva and for God or for spirit, or for a sense of abundance, we have to be open to changing our story. And I may not get to my third point, but I do want to talk about a flexibility and an openness to a new way of telling your story. I want to reflect something that moved me yesterday. We had a wonderful meeting, the whole clergy team, with a worker from Jacada, which is the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse. You can actually learn more about them on jacada.org. I'll write it into the comments here. Jacada is an amazing organization that's really helping women and men who are victims of domestic abuse, which can look like many things. It could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, even spiritual or abuse in a religious context. And Jacada serves for free, which is pretty amazing for an organization that does this work, clients all over Montgomery County, in the majority of area synagogues, including our own. Domestic abuse is a problem that affects Jews. We may not like to think that it does, but it does in the exact same rate as any other group. So this group is providing amazing resources to people who are trying to change their story. And again, their website is right there, and I encourage you to go. So why am I relating this? We as the clergy met with one of their counselors, and these are people who have been working with people who have told themselves one story about who they are in a relationship of abuse, that they perhaps deserve it, that they're undeserving of love, that they have to stay in for such and such reason. So people who have a story that may or may not be helping them at that time. And so I asked, when you're trying to heal trauma, how do you find that clients are able to change their story? So of course, it takes time. But one thing that really touched me was that the counselor said that, over time, we're able to be a mirror to our clients and to help them see the other stories that lie within them. Well, you've made it through all of this. I see you as a very strong person or a very loving person. But really being a mirror to them to help them see other possibilities for who they are. And so I guess my parting message with 1 minute before questions is really my second take home. The first is inventory. The second is to find a way or a person or a group in which you can retell your story. As Jews, actually, daily prayer is one of the ways that Jews tell our story in a positive and uplifting way. Thank you, God, for making me a Jew, for making me free, for opening my eyes, for making me who I am, for making me a part of a people with a special destiny. These are all blessings from the absolute beginning of the morning. And so so part of this can even happen in tefillah, in services. And I will say, I wish I had a copy right here, the new Sidur, Lev Shalem, it's hiding. The new Sidur that we actually have at Bethel has a lot of resources for reflecting on this kind of stuff. So I recommend you looking at it when you come to synagogue. But secondly, it's to find in your life a spouse, a friend, a partner, a therapist, you can call a spiritual chavruta, or even a support group to find a way to retell your story. I'll say personally, just to relate from my own experience, I have various stories of who I am. I'm a father, I'm a good vocalist, I'm a leader of cantors, I'm a spiritual guide, I'm a doting spouse. Any one of these can get very puffed up. So as I thought about this kind of work for my own self this morning, I thought, oh, things like a growing spouse or a deepening spiritual guide and focusing on process rather than product is certainly something that's speaking to me today. Um, some of you may think this is corny, but also think of how much money people are spending on self-help books, right, to accomplish this very same thing, to retell their story. So perhaps you have some of those books on your shelf as well. So I'm going to end my thing just to conclude with my two take-homes for the month of Elul, which is a month of taking stock of ourselves, of taking inventory, which I recommend you do, and a link to the Tshuva toolkit that I put into the comments. I thought would be helpful. I think will be helpful for that. If you are on a call and you can't get that, please email me at mklein@bethelmc.org, and I'm happy to share it with you. So the first is taking inventory, and the second is finding a place to tell and retell your story. Because by telling our story and imagining different stories for ourselves, especially with others who can lovingly mirror to us, we can discover perhaps how loved and how open to possibility that we really are. So now I would love some comments and questions and discussion, but please take your comments to the messaging system, right, to the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have for today. So I know that people will probably be typing. If you are interested, I will say also that if, in honor of the ability to study today, if you wanted to make, I would encourage actually you to go to jacada.org. One of the main things that they need is finances to help support their work in the community. So I'm personally pledging on here to make a donation to them today in honor of the messages of and possibilities of choice today. So it's just something I'm feeling moved to do today. Any questions? All right, I have a question. Thank you. Thank you, Marcy. When is it better to find a new person or group to retell your story to? And when is it better to retell your story to people who know and have loved you for a long time? This is a wonderful question. Again, it's the question of where is it safe to tell my story, right? Whether it's at within the system I work at home, or with my loved ones or intimates, or the beauty of a more anonymous or a more open place than that. It's a really excellent question. I think I don't have research on this. Let me say from my own experience, I found that both work in tandem. I found that in the groups that I've seen and attended when I've done my own work, that is very helpful because it's its own space. Actually, when I was learning with Rabbi Held yesterday, he says in some ways, for this retelling of story, it makes things like therapy and meditation a halachic imperative, right? A Jewish legal imperative to undergo that work because of the way that both of those things can reopen up one's story from being closed to having more possibilities. So that's a teaching that's really sticking with me in terms of the outside part of it. But of course, we're in an intimate system in our own families or loved ones in terms of who we are. And so finding a safe space for that is important too. And that's probably a longer discussion than I can have right now. And that's the Torah I have to share today. Thank you for that excellent question. Other questions? Just going to do a long cantorial recitative until I get a question. So until I get a question, I will actually move to the third source if I can. And please do interrupt me. Again, this is the first time we're trying this out, so if we end up finding a different way to get questions in advance or another way next time, that's fine. But again, thank you for that question. So for the third source, okay. Thank you for. I got a compliment on my recitatives. That's good. Well, it's you interpret the words through your voice, which is a cool thing. All right, back to tshuva. The last thing, which is a really interesting point that I got to learn from Rabbi Held yesterday, is about this Jewish idea of freedom being something that is chosen. Now, it's a bizarre thing because we normally think of freedom, we're free, we're naturally free to make our decisions, and yet much of our life seems predetermined, or we have automatic responses to things. And so there's a huge, I'm sure you've encountered it in your own organizations and just the psychologies and sociologies of your own profession, huge variance on how determined human beings are, on an advertising level, on a legal level, et cetera, et cetera. So one really interesting idea, and this comes through the Musar tradition, really the Jewish ethical tradition, is the idea of having to choose being free. I want to put up this source here, which are these two sources from Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Wolbe, which I was really thought was super cool. So Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik on repentance, who was the Rav, who was a big scholar at YU of modern orthodoxy, modern Jewish practice. This is what he says about choosing freedom. The assumption that man is free, that he has been endowed with the spiritual courage to make choices and with the power to determine the fate of his religious and moral life, this assumption cannot rely on the idea of belief by itself. It also depends on knowledge, on a feeling of being wholly charged by the tension present in this God-given factor of free choice. Free will should implant in man, or human beings, a sense of responsibility. That is the meaning of Maimonides' Deah, actually, what we talked about in the laws of personal change, Hilchot Deot. The meaning of Maimonides' Deah is a continuous awareness, or I would even say mindfulness, of maximal responsibility by the human being without even a moment's inattentiveness. It is a positive commandment to be conscious of the existence of free choice, which makes man responsible for his actions. One is forbidden to take one's mind off the principle of free choice, for it was not given to man only from without by tradition. It is also something in the nature of self-discovery, and also must always remain a part of the self, the knowledge that man can create worlds and destroy them. Again, a lot of text, but an interesting idea that we have to be aware of our freedom as we walk around in life. In the world of, there's a lot of dialogue around mindfulness, and certainly, my wife is a rabbi and does a lot of stuff about meditation and mindfulness. And perhaps one thing that is really transformative is to remind oneself, oh, I'm free. I am free. To get deeper into this, I want to go to Shlomo Wolbe, which is the second source, which should be in front of you now, thanks to amazing screen sharing. Thank you to GoToMeeting. Rabbi Wolbe, who's a Musar teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik is of a later generation. Rabbi Wolbe says this: let us examine ourselves. How often do we make use of our freedom, of the power of choice? Personal disposition, education, habit, and interests maintain almost absolute rule over us from childhood to old age. It is even possible for a person to go through her entire life without ever making use of her freedom. If we really examine ourselves, we'll see that we use our freedom only on rare occasions. Freedom is given, and yet in practice, personal disposition, education, habit, and interests carry the day, whether in large, fateful decisions or in small, day-to-day ones. And where is freedom? It is clear from this that freedom is not at all part of humanity's daily spiritual bread. It is rather one of the noble virtues which one must labor to attain. It is not lesser than love and fear and dvekut, cleaving to God, acquiring which clearly demands great effort. We can acquire freedom, and therefore we must acquire it. So again, a lot of text, very deep. I'm still digesting this myself. And I encourage you, by the way, we're going to end in about 6 minutes. And I encourage you to take some time and just sit with me one of these texts, at a time, or one offline. But it's a really amazing assertion that, we go through life thinking or asserting, oh yeah, I'm free. But carrying the really idea that you can acquire freedom through a mindfulness of freedom, that I'm not predisposed to, go to Starbucks for that extra cup of coffee, or I'm not necessarily predisposed to getting overwhelmed with anger, right? That these things that are so perhaps automatic for some of us, and in our various things that Rambam talked about earlier, right, with our predilections and the ways that we are, that reminding ourselves of our freedom is incredibly important, and indeed a mindfulness that we can take or if you want to use a modern terminology, a mantra that we can take into the day. That I am free, that my actions are not predetermined, and I have to choose freedom. It's that space between impulse and action. That is where, in fact, we find our humanity, and also, I think, Jewishly, our godliness, really our holiness, that part of ourselves that's like God, is the ability to stand back, say, oh, I am free to possibility in the same way that God is a little shimmer of God's freedom to possibility, and then to act from that. Okay, a lot to digest. See, I see. I told you it'd be full, and we didn't even order lunch for you, but we did order a very full spiritual lunch, thanks to Rabbi Wolbe and Rabbi Held and Rambam. A question. Um, Cheryl asks, aside from the whole concept of thoughts are free, aren't we only as free as we think we are? If we are bound by preconceptions and negative thoughts, we are not truly free. But it's not so easy to say, well, just think differently, and ultimately depends on our own strength of character and how we face life's challenges. So I'm going to try to reflect that back. Um, it's as much so it's not as much to say that if we certainly we can think that we're free, but we have a lot that's really binding us, and just saying, oh, we should just think differently, right? That's not an automatic thing, um, and it depends on our resources that we already have, whether we can even do that. So you know, I appreciate that question, Cheryl, because it can be easy to say, oh, just do this thing. This is your, take home solution. But these are really, they work into the realities of our lives. I remember Rabbi Held teaching yesterday that, the time that he usually starts thinking about tshuva is 2 days after Yom Kippur, when after seeing all this liturgy, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was supposed to actually be doing some personal change. So we're trying to head this off at the pass. But, we are constantly going back to, the way that we most naturally are. The chutzpah of Judaism is that we actually do think that people have the ability to change. So I think the one thing that I think is really important has to do with culture. And by culture, I mean who and how we surround ourselves. And this, I guess, is a bit of a final, not so final, I've got 3 minutes, take home on this subject, is that, I don't think a lot of us in around New Year's time in America, we go around and say, "Oh, what's your New Year's resolution?" Well, I want to lose weight. Well, I want to do this. Well, I want to breathe more, right? Um, but beyond that, we don't really have a culture that we've created of how is your Elul going? What is, how free do you feel, right? It sounds very like New Age to ask that of somebody. But indeed, I think that, a beautiful thing, and I think what I hope that things like things we're doing with the learning at Bethel and some of the great initiatives that our shul is doing is to create a culture of that, thinking about personal change is a normal thing. And is a thing that we can all share in. I think that when you have that culture of that creates more. It can catch more of what our individual selves might do, and let go of. There's a reason in Judaism that salvation happens and the spirituality happens in minyan, in community, right? That the spirit of God is felt in a group of 10. Why? Because the spirit and shared culture of 10 people is stronger in many ways than just the individual spiritual life of one. So, not to negate the importance of an individual practice, that is so important, and I'm very in favor of that. But having a communal conversation around tshuva, around personal change, around this season, I think is really important. Looking at realities, we have a long way to go. But if you want to talk to me or any of the clergy about your journey in personal change, that is our job. And if you have ideas for ways we can further that conversation in the community over this month and beyond, again, the gates of repentance, of tshuva, aren't really technically in our tradition closed until the end of Sukkot. And indeed, they are always open for those who are in a heart space to make the time and do that work. So please challenge us in our Bethel community, our clergy, and in general to help us make a culture of this, because I think that when the personal desire for change is matched to a communal desire for change, then I think you really have the potential for something great and for a godly spirit. It is 12:30. Thank you all so very much for this joining us for this first session. We'll be back next week at the same time at 12 o'clock. And again, for the next 3 weeks following this one, for a total of 4 of the month of Elul. It's been a pleasure to teach. Please email me with questions, follow-ups, feedback on today's session, comments, etc. It is a pleasure to teach Torah, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect on my own tshuva, on my own process, and to share it with all of you. And I hope that you can share that message, that culture, and that spirit with our whole community. And until next week or sooner. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'll stay on a couple extra minutes if there are a couple of questions.